It's the 12th of February 1809, and in a large house in Shrewsbury, England, a baby has just been born. He's the fifth child born to a wealthy doctor, and he will go on to change the world. His name is Charles Darwin, and both sides of his family are well known in both politics and various academic fields, especially his grandfather Erasmus. As a child, Darwin was fascinated by nature, but his father's expectations led him towards a different path. At 18, he began working as an apprentice doctor, and later enrolled at Edinburgh Medical School. However, Darwin had little interest in medicine and barely studied. His father decided instead to send him to Cambridge to become an Anglican priest. But once again nature called, as he found more excitement in collecting beetles than studying theology. Despite these distractions, he ranked 10th out of 178 candidates, and more importantly became acquainted with scientists at the university who saw his potential and enthusiasm. With these friends, he planned to travel to the island of Tenerife after graduating. To prepare, Darwin spent 2 weeks on a course studying geology in the Welsh mountains. Upon returning home, he found a letter that would change both his life and the course of history. It had been sent from his close friend Henslow, who had recommended Darwin as a naturalist to go on a self-funded trip aboard the HMS Beagle. The ship was captained by Robert Fitzroy, and it would set sail for South America to chart its coastline. Darwin was, as expected, eager to join the voyage, but not everyone approved. His father thought that it was a waste of time, and was initially not going to pay for the trip, but Darwin's uncle convinced him otherwise, and on the 27th of December 1831, after months of delays, the Beagle set off from Plymouth. By then, Darwin was already considered an expert in beetles and marine invertebrates, but was a novice when it came to any other creatures. However, this didn't stop him from taking notes on everything he came across. The first stop was planned to be at the town of Santa Cruz on Tenerife, and the Beagle pulled into its harbour. However, due to fears of cholera spreading from England, the Beagle was denied landing. Darwin, who had been wanting to visit Tenerife, was understandably annoyed, especially considering how tantalizingly close he was. Nevertheless, the Beagle carried on and headed to Cape Verde. On the way down, he took the opportunity to use a plankton net and view what he caught under a microscope. To his surprise, these tiny creatures exhibited an incredible diversity of sizes, forms, and colors. Darwin at the time could not comprehend why so many creatures had been created for what seemed like such little purpose. The Beagle stopped for 23 days on Santiago Island, which Darwin used to study its geology. Here, he took note of the color-changing octopus, who outshone even the chameleon. To him, it seemed as if they had been given the same ability for the same purpose, despite being very different creatures. After the crew's surveys had finished, they set off once again, with Darwin growing increasingly impatient to see the tropical forests of Brazil. Right in the middle, they stopped at St. Paul's Rocks. To his disappointment, Darwin could not find a single plant or lichen there, and so it helped little with his study of the natural world. But he did notice how tame the seabirds were, so tame that he could catch them. Here, he missed the opportunity to realize the reason for this was because they had no native predators, and thus lost all fear. By the 28th of February, Brazil's coast was in sight, and they arrived that same day. Darwin was immediately enamored with the tropical rainforest, which were alive with the sounds of birds in the day and frogs and insects at night. But not everything he came across in Brazil left him in awe, as near the town he saw something appalling: slavery. Living in England, he had never seen something so cruel, and expressed his disdain with the other members of the crew. However, Captain Fitzroy firmly defended slavery. He brought Darwin to meet a slave owner and asked the slaves if they wished to be freed, to which they replied no out of fear for their own safety. Darwin argued that the slaves were under pressure to respect their owner. Then Fitzroy became enraged that Darwin challenged him and threatened to end the voyage. Fortunately, by the time Darwin arrived back in England, it was banned in the British Empire. After surveying the coast of Brazil and Uruguay, they began what was possibly the most consequential part of the voyage. Slowly navigating the coast, on the 22nd of September, the Beagle reached Bahia Blanca. Here along the cliffside, Darwin excavated various fossils of extinct mammals, which resembled giant versions of similar creatures such as the sloth and the armadillo. But what he found more interesting was that they could be found in the same layer as modern seashells. He realized that this indicated a recent extinction, without a noticeable change in the environment. The link between extinct creatures and modern ones would soon lead him to the origin of species. Darwin also rode on horseback into the country's interior, where he discovered that the ranges of two rare species overlapped. The smaller species had not yet been discovered, and is known today as Darwin's rare. Leaving the temperate plains of Argentina, the Beagle sailed south towards the southern tip of Patagonia. Here Darwin encountered indigenous people, whom at the time were considered uncivilized savages. Darwin, however, was confident that all humans shared a common origin. From there, Fitzroy insisted on going back north to verify measurements, giving Darwin another chance to study the area. Once again, he found fossils of giant extinct animals and headed inland. But despite these amazing discoveries, he also came into serious danger. Rebels had blocked the Paraná River, which he was traveling down. However, he managed to sneak through with some refugees and reached the Beagle. They then sailed past Patagonia and to the coast of Chile, whose temperate rainforest provided some strange creatures for Darwin to examine. Due to the country's lengthy and winding coast, Darwin had ample time to explore. From the seaside, he hiked up into the Andes, marveling at the surreal scenery. However, on the descent he fell seriously ill, and spent an entire month laying in bed. It's unknown what caused this, but many scientists suspect he had contracted Chagas disease. After mapping the coast, the Beagle began heading towards the Galapagos Islands. Little does Darwin know, but the research he will collect there will change the course of history forever. Within a week, Darwin arrived on San Cristobal Island, which gave him his first impressions of the Galapagos. And whilst it seems strange looking back, this impression was anything but positive. He thought the giant tortoises were almost antediluvian, and called the marine iguanas the most disgusting, clumsy lizards. And despite his indifference to the native fauna, since the Beagle had to stop on 3 islands, he inevitably studied the local fauna. He noticed that although very similar to mockingbirds on the mainland, each island had its own variety, though he didn't yet realize why. He also met with the governor of the Galapagos, who could identify which island a tortoise came from just based on the shape of its shell. However, Darwin believed the finches were unrelated to each other, and misidentified them as wrens and blackbirds. After collecting the necessary measurements, on the 20th of October, the Beagle set off across the Pacific to Tahiti. Here, to Darwin's delight, the locals had adopted Christianity. However, he didn't have such a nice experience in New Zealand, describing the English residents as of the most worthless character, most of whom were runaway convicts from Australia. And without noting much about the island's animals, Darwin soon arrived in Sydney, Australia. Of course, it was the unique animals rather than the city that caught his attention. 2 particular animals he came across, the platypus and potoroos, were so strange to him that it was as if 2 different creators had designed them. And unlike many other Europeans, he found the Aboriginals to be good-humoured and pleasant. This made him particularly sad, as their populations had declined by as much as 90% since Europeans arrived. They also told him something that even he couldn't believe, that the mammalian platypus laid eggs. From Australia, the Beagle made stops in the Cocos Islands, Mauritius, Cape Town, St. Helena and Ascension Island. On this part of the journey, not much notable took place, but ideas of the variability and origin of species began to brew in Darwin's mind. It was then that Fitzroy decided they needed to go back to Brazil to verify some measurements, giving Darwin another chance to see the tropical forests. And soon, after a brief detour, 5 years after setting off, on the 2nd of October 1836, the Beagle arrived back in England. By then, his writings had been carefully examined by the scientific community, garnering him notability. After making a short visit to his family in Shrewsbury, Darwin went to Cambridge to discuss the voyage with his friend Henslow. From there, with an investment from his father, Darwin travelled across London to search for naturalists to help him. However, at the time this was a difficult task, as zoologists were busy examining the vast amount of specimens coming in from across the British Empire. A few months later, ornithologist John Gould realised the blackbirds Darwin had collected in the Galapagos were actually 12 distinct kinds of finches. Darwin then cross-referenced Fitzroy's notes and found that each species Gould identified came from a different island. By March, Darwin began to contemplate species gradually becoming others. In July, he expanded upon those ideas by sketching a branching tree of the scent. Unfortunately, as his health began to suffer, his progress on writing slowed, but he still kept pushing on. He talked to pigeon selective breeders and ran his own experiments to gather evidence for his theories. It made sense to assume that individuals more suited to the environment had a better chance of surviving, and thus the theory of evolution was born. By 1838, he was completely convinced of his theory, and upon seeing an orangutan at the zoo, began to ponder whether humans were apes. However, it would be a while until he gave the world his theory, as he felt it was essential to collect all the information possible to avoid backlash. At the time, he wrote that it was like confessing a murder. What Darwin didn't know was that across the world, a fellow scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, was independently progressing towards the theory of evolution. By 1856, Darwin was well aware of this, and in 1858 he suspended his plans for writing an all-encompassing book and began writing a shorter one. For 13 months he fought against his own health issues, as well as coping with the deaths of 3 of his children, but was finally ready to publish. Named On the Origin of Species, it was released on the 22nd of November 1859. Within the scientific community, evolution quickly became accepted, with science beating out religion. But among the population at scale, particularly the church, evolution was considered blasphemy. And 23 years after publishing On the Origin of Species, Darwin died at the age of 73 at his home in southeast England. However, his legacy certainly lives on. 68 years after his death, the Catholic Church accepted evolution as fact. But even after all the evidence, including the discovery of DNA, in countries such as the USA, as much as half of the population doesn't believe in evolution. However, as the internet expands and information is freely shared, we can only expect evolution to become more accepted.